and we'll get started. So good to see everyone. Pruning of fruits 101 here. Hopefully we give you enough to start, gaining that confidence, but really with pruning, it's just practice. I've gotten to where I almost feel like I'm naked if I'm not out in the yard with at least my hand shears, maybe the loppers close by. So a lot of this just takes time and practice and doing it, and then seeing how that plant responds that following season. So our terms are important because we want to train these to different forms depending on what we're growing. So we're going to talk about open center, the central leader, which is going to be more of your apple and your pear. Open center typically is the way we would train a peach. And the reason why we train these in these forms is because it sort of follows the natural tendency of these plants. We have, of course, the parts, the nomenclature. The leader is that central leader. That's the main trunk. You have your scaffold branches that you're trying to position at good angles, both at the point of attachment, but also around that main leader. Water sprouts, graft unions, suckers, all of these things are important terms so we can sort of dialogue and communicate and know that we're talking about the same things. We're going to then get into how to make these pruning cuts, how to maybe drop a limb that's a little bit bigger than what you would drop with, say, loppers or something like that, and tools and the proper tools and how to keep them from spreading diseases within your trees and within your orchard. So review basics, as I said, we're not going to go over all the stuff you need to do. We're going to cover that on the 25th of February. So, but probably the most important thing, because pruning is a way to control the size, but you can always be in a situation where you're fighting the nature of the plant. And so the rootstock selection is critically important so you can enjoy growing fruits and less just vigorous pruning every winter. So if you leave here with one thing not related to pruning, know that rootstock selection when we're talking about apples and pears is critically important. And if you don't know the rootstock, then chances are you have a standard size or at least an M111. It's going to be a very vigorous root, and it's going to require probably more aggressive pruning and eventually be a much bigger tree than what most of us want to manage. And a good visual representation here is these are all the same variety, all the same age. Over here, you have actually a semi-dwarf tree, which is probably still 15 to 16 feet tall. Here you have a smaller semi-dwarf. You're looking at more like 10 feet tall. And then you have a true dwarf over on this side. They all have positives and negatives, but again, this just shows you the importance of that rootstock in helping to control the vigor. And there are ways to grow much smaller fruit trees that make pruning much easier, done with hand loppers instead of roofing ladders and climbing skills. So this is a trellis with dwarfing apple rootstock. Of course, these are still somewhat young. These are just 2 years young at this point, but these will be trees that, again, are only going to have a root system about the size of a, mature tomato plant. So that's why the wires are there, because these will not have enough roots to hold up the plant. So you lose some things with the smaller rootstocks, but at the same time, hopefully you can then just grow more fruit in a smaller area. So our training systems are partly, if you've inherited old trees like myself, apples, we want to talk about a central leader, but a lot of people have trained them to be that open center. That's not ideal. And it's harder to correct trees that were trained in the wrong form after the fact. So some of this, our training systems are going to be what type of fruit are we growing? What type of rootstock are we growing? How many trees do we want to jam into a space? Because pruning is a way to influence size or dwarfing, but we don't want to always be out there pruning, because anytime we open up that plant to a wound, that's a potential place where disease can enter the plant. So the less pruning we have to do, really the better. And so all of these things, how comfortable you are at heights or ladders, what tools you want to use, is all going to play into the type of training system that you want to implement for your trees. And this is a little bit of review, but we have to know that all trees are basically two parts. You have the variety that you're shopping for, that Granny Smith or Elbert Peach, something like that. That is up here, and that's the scion variety. You usually have a swelling that happens, that graft union or bud union, and then you have a rootstock that is actually a completely different plant. And so when we start getting into pruning trees that have maybe been left alone, oftentimes you will have a secondary trunk, often that is more vigorous and overtakes the original trunk. And sometimes it is the rootstock variety that is then starting to grow. That is not desirable. Happens a lot in pears, but can even happen in apples. Peaches less so, but you'll see it a lot on pears. You'll get a shoot that shoots out from below this graft union, and we have to know how to spot those because we want to cut those out. Okay, so if we're talking that central leader, if you're buying a plant through the mail or off the retail garden center lot, usually it doesn't have a perfect form, and you have to sort of wonder, gosh, where am I going to get a central leader? How am I shaping this thing? So sometimes they'll come, they sort of look like this. They've already got branches. Ideally, you're removing almost all of that. You're choosing, something that looks like it's in the center, the most upright with, no bad angles on it. And you can see here, they've cut out everything else, that A, B, and C. They've left B. A and C are gone, and it looks like one other one is gone here in the back. And, a lot of newcomers to the fruit gardening world would think I have removed too much, but this is absolutely what we would want to do with that plant coming off of, the garden center. The next year, you can see what they have done here is remove all that, and then they probably did a heading cut here and here and here. By doing that heading cut, we will disrupt that auxin and make these buds below that cut turn into branches. And you can see that's sort of what's happened here. Cut this, they get more branching here. Cut this, heading cut, more branching here. So this is a 2, 3, 4 year process of just developing your architecture. So this tree at hopefully year 3 to 5 can start supporting the weight of fruit. And we want to position these, you can see here as a top-down view around that trunk, because we're basically growing solar panels. These have to receive sunlight. And so we want probably that first layer of scaffolds, no more than, say, 3 good scaffold branches in the 360-degree pattern around that trunk. Then we want a second layer of scaffolds, probably about 3 feet above where that last one ends on that first layer. Because we want sun and wind and air moving through this plant. With our high humidity and things like that, the more drying we can have happen after morning dews, afternoon thunderstorms in the summertime, the more these plants can dry out, the better off you're going to be, the healthier of a plant, and the more quality of fruit you're going to have. But oftentimes I see folks, they just impulse buy and they put it in and they never prune. And you can see the sort of, just bad growth that's going to happen, poor branch angles. And eventually, I've got some slides here in a minute, you will see these things will inevitably fail because of a fruit load, because of wind load. So we want to develop these good angles from the very start. And this is what it would look like on a very young tree. You can see he's probably, this is fine. I would say, 4 branches for those scaffolds in that first layer. And what you may find at a certain point is one of these is going to get too crowded. Probably this lowest one is going to eventually be shaded out. So no more than 4 scaffolds in any one layer of scaffolds. And most of us, we don't need more than 2 layers of scaffolds on that central leader. Beyond that, you're talking about a 12-foot and above tree. So we want to sort of form them like a Christmas tree to be, wider at that first layer. And then your next layer isn't going to be able to, extend out 6-7 feet of branches because you're going to be shading out your first layer of scaffolds at that point. And you can see here, this guy's doing a heading cut about 3 feet above where this first layer of scaffolds has been established that first year. This is best done in dormancy, and I'll show you a picture of trying to push these trees too much. You don't get as much branch development by doing this in the summertime. So wait till the next year, and that's when you can get your second layer of scaffolds. So a heading cut here disrupts that auxin, which is that growth hormone, and it sort of signals to these buds below that cut, usually about 12 inches below that cut. All of these buds are then signaled that they need to be the new leader. All right. So one of them you'll allow to go straight up, and you have to know that you make that heading cut. All of these buds that turn into shoots, they all want to shoot straight up. Again, that's why we use this central leader. It's a very strong center of axis type of training method, which is the natural tendency for your apples and your pears. One of them allows to go straight up. The other ones, you have to be there ready to start bending them down, because otherwise that branch angle will be too poor. So usually a clothespin attached to your leader to get that new shoot that's going to come out, just to get it to bend out just a little bit. And that's usually all that's required to set that good angle. And so we've already started introducing this concept of training your limbs. And you can see if you don't train these limbs, especially on pear, oftentimes on apple, you get this poor angle set. And because trees grow on that outside layer out, every year, you have what's called that included bark. This is why those Bradford pear trees always break, is because you have this point of weakness where that bark is just growing in together. You're pushing those branches out in a bad way, and a fruit load, a wind load, an ice load will just split these any day of the week. That could happen as it grows up and matures. So, and this is to sort of show you, you can see a tree here at my house. This tree has just been a textbook example. The trees don't read the books, unfortunately. They don't always do what we're trying to get them to do. So you can see my first layer of scaffolds, only 3. And see the string here, I have tied them down to set that good angle. I really like just tying the limbs down after I've already set the angle here at the leader. So I tried to rush this one. I did a heading cut, again, in the summertime. And you can see that bud has then broken. Ideally, this is the new leader. Scaffold, scaffold, scaffold will happen below it. But I have to get a clothespin in there to get that angle to start coming out. However, this is best done in dormancy. This was just for the slide set. Doing this in summer, that growth pathway and the hormones have already been distributed, and you get less of a growth response by doing this in the summertime. Summer pruning is really to control vigor. We actually want to invigorate these buds to develop branches. So just plan on, at least 2 years, if not 3 years, to train that tree to get your architecture. And you can do this in different ways. They make branch spreaders. I like tying down like is shown here. And you'll notice that these trees are kind of on permanent posts. A lot of that is, number one, dependent on your rootstock, but also sometimes on your soil type. So these trees here are probably semi-dwarf, but they may have a soil type that doesn't allow for good anchorage. And so in this situation, that post is almost permanent because if they don't hold their own weight upright without a fruit load, you can imagine once they have 50 to 100 or more 1 pound fruits hanging on there, they're really not going to stay upright. So something to plan for and consider. And this is, to me, is too many branches. And that's fine. You can have more branches than kind of these rules of 3-4 scaffolds, 3 feet, another 3-4, because this tree is small, it's young. You might as well be getting more fruit on it as you're developing that permanent goal of that rule, which is 3-4 scaffolds, 3 feet, 3-4 scaffolds. Because you can, again, get fruit on it in the meantime. But know that eventually these, like this branch here, is probably coming out. This branch here, because it looks like there's 2 or 3, at least 1, if not 2 of those is probably coming out. But it's growing this way because it's young enough, it's small enough. It could at least make fruit on these smaller branches in the meantime. To do this, you can also use weights. So here's different types of branch spreaders. I don't love branch spreaders because a number of reasons. One, you can be damaging that young, thin bark, again, creating wounds where the tree can then have disease issues. But I found them to always just pop out unexpectedly. Wind comes by, and next thing you know, you're picking up your branch spreaders. So that's why I really do like just using string, tying them down, anchoring that to either a rock or a sod staple. You can use weights. So these ugly Christmas ornaments, this is just cement in nursery pots with a wire. This works until it doesn't. And so if that branch is still a little too soft and supple, you may come out here one day and the whole branch has just fallen off, detached from the main trunk. So you don't want to get in that situation because you may not get a branch in that same spot back. If it's a year old, and it's got that woody layer already, then the weights are probably fine, but you definitely don't want to use weights in that first year when that's still soft green wood. And you can get crazy trading these things in all sorts of ornamental patterns. Of course, there's Espalier. That's a lot more pruning. That's a lot more attention to tying branches. And a lot more focus on summer pruning so you don't shade the whole thing out. Or, they used to grow grapes this way without trellises and wires. And I think it's a very attractive way to grow grapes. So you, again, sort of build a permanent architecture of these woody stems, where then annually, your shoots are just sort of growing off in any which way, knowing that your grape clusters are here sort of at the base. You probably could not do this with muscadine. As cool as it would look, I don't think muscadine would ever woody up in one strong trunk without at least a permanent post on it. So, but bunch grapes probably could pull that off. So, if I haven't lost you yet, like this guy has lost his marbles, we'll get into the specifics of where to make these cuts. And some of your tools. Why we prune, as I said, we want to develop that permanent structure, develop a plant that is going to be able to hold fruit loads. We were talking about if this is a mature apple tree, pear tree, you're going to have hundreds of pounds of fruit. hanging on in the wind, in conditions. So you have to develop that structure. Pruning helps to remove defects, both in the branches. It can help to prevent defects. If we just have too many branches, those are going to start to scratch on fruit. So again, we're opening the plant up, preventing defects, but your pruning goals are always removing defects if we're talking about this time of year. And really, most of our fruits, once they actually become mature, they are going to set too many fruits. It's the plant's goal to set a seed. It's not to develop the biggest, nicest flesh. It's to reproduce through seeds. So it doesn't need all of that fruity juiciness that we want. It's just trying to ripen seeds. So this is a way to thin that fruit load before bloom. And if we talk about summer pruning, it's a way to keep that tree manageable. Because again, that vigorous growth response, it happens with dormant pruning. Summer pruning helps to control and maintain that size. So, then that's what we'll talk about is bud position and the plant's response to our action, this pruning, because depending on where we cut and when we cut, the plant is going to have a different response to our pruning. And to do this well and to have success, you really need to know what your buds look like. There's a difference between a leaf bud and a flower bud, fruit bud. And where these buds are found is different depending on what plant we are talking about. So figs, I love figs for a number of reasons. They're one of the easiest plants to grow, but you almost can't prune them wrong if you are pruning in dormancy, because figs are going to put their fruit buds on that current season's growth. So quite easy, you can prune them to the ground, and in theory, they should still carry fruit by the end of the summer, because they carry fruit buds on that year's growth. If we're talking about peaches or stone fruits, we're generally talking about only 1-year-old wood. So we have to always be pruning in a way that we want to maximize the amount of 1-year-old wood and then retain as much of that 1-year-old wood, because that's where our fruit flower buds are. Apples and pears, for the most part, now there's exceptions, for the most part, we're talking about at least 2-year-old wood, if not 3-year-old and older wood for those plants. Muscadines, it is current season's growth that starts from last year's buds. So usually with muscadines, we're leaving these things, they're not true spurs, but we call them spurs. And that's 2 or 3 buds or nodes from last year, so we can get that first shoot, and that's where your fruit cluster is going to hang. Persimmons, a lot like figs, in that they're going to flower on current season's wood. Very nice, because we can prune them, much easier. There's less guesswork with those. Blackberries and raspberries as well. These are perennial plants that we manage as 2-year-old vegetation. So they grow up 1 year for the most part. They grow up that first year. We call them a primocane, and it's just vegetative growth at that point. The second year that cane overwinters, then it's a floricane. Once it blooms and then sets fruit, it dies. The sooner we can prune that out after we've harvested our fruit, the better we are going to be. So really, we should be in pruning blackberries in July. We should be in there cutting those canes out after we've picked berries and getting them out of there, because eventually, they're going to start to develop rust and other diseases, and we don't want that passing on to the primocanes that are growing right next to those spent floricanes. So really, with blackberries, most of your pruning should be done really in the middle of summertime. All right, so this is just a bunch of gratuitous pictures of buds. This is important. All right, so this is that same apple tree that I showed you from a couple slides ago. This is just last summer, so I think it's got a year or 2 years growth from that first picture. So should I expect fruit on this still young tree? And if so, where should I expect it? So we have a close-up of a leaf bud that's out here, and you can see how closely attached that little triangle form. That is only a leaf bud, and we're going to find these on 1-year-old wood all the way up these really vigorous. You see how vigorous this young tree is. The vigor in this tree will start to slow down, hopefully, as I start to develop fruits, because that energy that goes into forming fruits and ripening seeds will take away some of that vegetative vigor. So out here, this is what we're looking at for leaf buds. This is the start of a fruit spur, and you can see these short little stems inside here, not the old pruning, nubs I've left, but right here, and this is a close-up. So see the shape of that bud and that shortened stem. This is a flower bud on this apple tree. And this is only going to be found down in here where this wood is, 2-3 years old, not out here. And if you have older trees, as I do, these spurs will just continue to grow a little bit. It's pretty amazing. They will grow anywhere between a 1/4 inch to a 1/2 inch in a season. And these things can remain productive for 10 to 15 years. So we don't want to buy that house with these old trees and go in here and just start losing all of these old fruit spurts, because you don't get them back again for another 2-3 years. And so you can see these little wrinkles. So that's 1 year's worth of growth. And then there's that bud scar that happens. And then the next year it grows a little bit more. So flower bud, flower bud, flower bud, flower bud, flower bud, flower bud. A lot of apples. And if you think about a pear and an apple bud, inside that bud, you usually have 5 to 6 flowers that will come out in a cluster. Then our job as the orchardist, hopefully after fruit set, is we go in and we just pinch out the undesirable ones, the ones that maybe only get pollinated halfway or have a bug damage. Because on this cluster, on this spur, I probably wouldn't want to ripen more than 2 mature apples. Because usually we want air and sunlight around that fruit as well. So that's a lot of, then, usually I'm doing that by mid-May. I'm going in and thinning these out. But there is the exception, pears especially, but then we also have tip-bearing apples. So they will also have a flower bud set at the tip of this shortened branch. So you have to prune them a little bit different, but do know that you still usually get some kind of spurring type action. And usually the branches that have the flower bud out at the tip are usually shorter than, you say, your vegetative branches. So if we do a heading cut here, we would remove that, but you also have flower buds here. So that would be a pruning cut I would probably make still here, knowing that I'm removing a fruit cluster, but I still have fruit clusters closer to the trunk. Because if I set a fruit here, this poor little branch is going to be bent, completely down. So, but this is a good consideration if you do want to try Espalier or something like that, is these types of varieties are not well suited to growing on wires and keeping in a very contained, tight growing system. They do tend to have more vigor and just become bigger trees. So they are not going to be varieties that are going to do well with growing a patio apple in a pot or even on a wire type system for Espalier. All right, a peach, you can see this is a much different form in that there's no central leader continuing on. Sort of the same in that we have the scaffolds here at the base, but again, we want this thing to where you can almost land a helicopter in the middle. You want 3, maybe 4 scaffold branches that go in that martini glass shape, I guess, or something like that. And again, only last year's wood is where our flower buds will be found. So now this is reproductive, non-reproductive portion of the tree. This is only holding up fruit weight anymore, and even this to some degree. So summer pruning on peaches is critically important to keep that growth closer to the center trunk, because if you're every year you're going 4 feet farther away from the trunk, it's going to mean just that much bigger of a plant, probably more risk of breaking limbs and branches. So we want to do summer pruning probably twice on a peach just to keep things within bounds. Peaches respond incredibly well to pruning. They are very vigorous if you've done everything right as far as soil and proper placement. And so I had this picture here around this time last year. And so the question then was, should I expect fruit and where? And again, like I've already talked about, and this peach, only 3 years old, even with disease and a few worms, I still got at least a half a bushel of peaches off this one tree in the 3rd year. So if we see here, that's where a year ago, the growth stopped. We have this bud scar, that terminal bud scar. And then that, at that point, was 1-year-old wood. This was 2-season-old wood. But this shoot is 1-year-old wood, but that was the terminal bud scar there. This is what you're looking at with peach buds. So if you have flower buds, you will find this cute little rabbit foot. One bud in the middle, that's your leaf bud, and then these 2 outer buds are your fruit or your flower buds. So as you'll see in this picture, and this is where, after pruning, a lot of hobbyists fail, is because if you actually have a year where you set a crop, you will have too much weight on this limb. If every single one of these starts to develop into fruit, these branches will break or drag to the ground. So we have to be out here pretty early after fruit set to thin these out, because ideally we want a fruit about every 6 inches on this stem. What do we have? At least 10 potential fruits already right here at bloom stage. So fruit thinning after our pruning and training is probably the most important task that's always underdone. On a pear, pears can look pretty goofy. Pears, more than apples, will bear on younger wood or at the tip. But depending on the variety, most of the time you will also have these spurs. Kind of different looking than on the apples. That is your flower cluster that will come out there. But don't be surprised if you also see flower clusters come out of what should be just, kind of your traditional leaf buds. Pears are notorious, if they don't get frozen out, sort of like peaches, are notorious for overbearing, and then you are in a problem of you may lose entire limbs. So we got to get out there and thin fruit, or do it at the blossom stage if you want to. You can always just remove blossoms. I don't like for any of these trees to set fruit really the first 3 years if I'm talking about apples and pears. Pears can be a little bit slower to come into bearing. Apples, don't be surprised if you get flowers on them by year 3. To me, that's too early for them to start carrying fruit. I really want to develop that architecture those first 3 years at least, if not even 4 years, because once they start going into reproductive fruit ripening, your expectations of growth are going to, greatly slow down, and you may still want to train branches and get that thing set up. On a plum, plums are a lot like peaches, so you can look for, again, that same 1, 1, 1 with your flower buds on the outside, but you also kind of get spurs on plums. So they're a little bit of a mixed bag, and those spurs will be at the base of 1-year-old wood where it's meeting 2-year-old wood. So flowers here, 2-year-old growth, and then flowers out on last year's growth. And your persimmons, you can see how green this young stem is. This is pre-bloom. And if you've ever seen the blossom on a persimmon, they're really kind of cool. They're almost perfectly square. So post-bloom, that's the young fruit that's starting to develop inside that persimmon. And you will probably have to thin some of these, you know, assuming all of them set. And that's the nice thing about persimmons. This is the nice thing about both muscadines and figs as well, is if we talk about plums, we talk about pears, bloom happens so early, we're always in that, you know, kind of still freezing or risk of freezing temperatures. Last year it happened April 21. So that's why probably nobody had great pears or great plums. The nice thing about persimmons is, you know, rarely are you ever going to have bloom be just frozen out. And the same with figs and muscadines. We're talking about blueberries. Blueberries are going to bloom at the top of the bush for the most part. The top of the bush, and looking at my bushes a few days ago, it's kind of hard to tell the difference between your flower buds and your leaf buds yet. But here in another 2 weeks to 4 weeks, these flower buds really start to swell up. And it's very easy to tell the difference between a vegetative bud and a flower bud here in a couple weeks, because they will just start to really swell up. You can prune these all the way up until bloom if you haven't done it yet. My main goal with dormant pruning on my blueberries is I just like to thin this out. This is a little too hairy in here for me. If we're talking about the crown of that plant, you know, probably 3-4 main trunks should be your goal. And all of this little insignificant stuff, you know, these root suckers, kind of, you know, thin those out. I would remove all this lower stuff, you know, again, just so I'm staying a little bit drier. I have less rain splash or soil splash coming up into the lower portion of the plant. And then, you know, going in here and removing crossing branches, removing stuff that's growing back towards the inside of the bush. You know, we're training these, you know, almost just like a rose or, you know, one of our flowering shrubs. We're just trying to keep the thing growing outwards, limiting crossing branches and rubs, and then just opening up the base a little bit. Your tools are important. As much as you're going to have these tools in your hands, I really like to invest in, you know, nicer tools, not just the, you know, stuff at the checkout line. So a good pair of bypass hand pruners, that's here. I really like pairs where I can take them apart. I can replace that blade and maybe sharpen them if I need to. So a good pair of hand pruners. Eye protection, if you're going to be dealing around your trees, always have eye protection. I don't know how many times I catch little insignificant branches in my glasses. If you don't have them on, it is not hard to get a pretty bad scratch or even really damage your eye. So eye protection, hand loppers or hand pruners. A good pair of loppers goes a long way, and a handsaw. If you don't have big trees, these 3 tools are really all you need. You could do branches up to 2.5 inches with these hand loppers. About 1 inch is probably all you want to do with your hand pruners. And if it becomes too hard to really, you know, just easily go through that branch, you know, that's when you need to just size up to the next tool. If you're really wrenching on your hand loppers, then that's when you reach for your folding saw or your pruning saw. And these saws have really aggressive teeth patterns. They work on the pull action, and they do a really good job on anything, I would say, up to 4 or 5 inches. If you have bigger trees and limbs, in my opinion, the best tool for the job is a cordless reciprocating saw with a pruning blade. I have cut branches, easily 10 inches around, and it works great. Most of us should not be using chainsaws. Chainsaws and pruning on your fruit trees, that's only if you want to do the final pruning cut at the ground. It is too hard to not have collateral damage with the chainsaw. So these tools, very, very nice. You can be precise and cut in exactly the right position you want to cut in. And then always have sanitizing wash. So if you're dealing with disease, even if you're not dealing with disease, we should be sanitizing our tools in theory between each cut, but at least in between each tree if you have more than one tree. And I use alcohol. You can use Lysol, you can use bleach. Bleach is a little bit harsher on your metal, and that's why I use alcohol, but the spray, Lysol works just as well too. You do have to clean first, so wipe off sawdust and dirt, and then sanitize. And then, of course, we're dealing with nice, hopefully nice metal that we want to keep sharp and not have rust. So mineral oil, maybe after each time you use these tools before you put them away, just go ahead and rub some mineral oil on there. And don't be tricked into thinking that the mineral oil for cutting boards is the only option. You can get the mineral oil in the pharmacy section, and it's a fraction of the price. And that's what I use. That cutting board mineral oil is pretty expensive, and the laxative mineral oil, I think, works just as well. I think I've already covered this. Great. Here we go. So pruning terms, heading and thinning cuts. Those are two very different cuts, and they're going to have different growth responses within the plant. You'll hear, if you watch other videos or read publications on pruning, the 3 Ds. So we can always prune dead, diseased, and damaged wood, not just in dormancy. Any time of the year we observe dead, diseased, or damaged wood, we can remove it. And usually if it's diseased wood, we want to prune it out at least 8 inches or 10 inches below where we see that disease infection, because chances are it's below where we're able to observe it. And I'm going to show you how to get some of those bigger limbs out safely without damaging the tree or hurting yourself. And that pruning budget rule, that's kind of a fluid rule. We could probably debate that. So our heading cut is what we're doing here on this left side. So we are removing sort of nubs. These are usually the types of cuts the landscapers are doing to crepe myrtles. So we are doing a heading cut typically on our fruit trees, again, in that training process. So we're removing back to a bud, knowing that we are going to invigorate those buds below there and develop branches. So it is a cut that we use a good deal, but we have to understand if we do a lot of heading cuts, we're going to make for bushier plants with a lot of stems and shoots, and probably then set ourselves up for more pruning the following summer or definitely the following winter. Meanwhile, thinning cuts, where we are pruning all the way back to the point of origin, is less invigorating. So chances are you're still probably going to get a water sprout coming out of where that thing was cut, but these types of cuts are going to be less invigorating to that plant because you still have a high point here. You still have that auxin that's limiting or controlling growth below it. If you disrupt all that auxin, then you're going to have just a bushy plant with a ton of shoots. And if we're looking at a stem, I already talked about some of this already. So we have that terminal bud. You may have these little spots on a branch or a stem. Those are linocells. Those are air pores where the plant does breathe. Those are usually very different looking. It's hard to get confused with those being actual buds. Typically, our buds are just right above where there was a leaf. So you have your leaf scar here and your bud. Usually those buds for next year are set. Usually by August, next year's buds are already being set. There's that terminal bud scar from last year. So this is where that terminal bud was a year ago. Internodes are the areas between buds. So usually if we're talking about doing heading cuts, we don't want to just prune and leave a nub above that bud that we're leaving. We usually want to make a cut just right above and cut out most of that internode. And when we talk about this auxin and the plant's response, that auxin is most concentrated in that terminal bud. And auxin is really controlling the growth up, but it's also limiting the growth below that point. So when we do that heading cut, we disrupt that auxin and we redistribute it, and then you get more shoots. So that auxin is important to understand how it works and how our pruning interventions is going to factor into growth. But auxin does make for nice, crotch angles, call them branch angles or crotch angles, which is desirable. So we all know this, trees grow up, but they're also growing around every year. And this is very apparent and obvious in pears, and that's what we talked about earlier, which is that good branch angling. Because they're growing radially, you end up with compression and included bark if you don't have that good angle. So you can see here, and what's happening is you're getting a radial layer on the say trunk or the leader, and then you're also getting another layer radially on that branch. And so they're sort of interweaving over the years. And that is what we want. We want that interlocking, that really strong attachment. If they're not able to do that because of limited space, then you just end up with that compression and that included bark that eventually will be a failure point. So where we make these pruning cuts is we have the branch collar, and you can see this area of swelling. This is our main trunk. You have all of these cells that are sort of almost like stem cells in mammals, that if we cut and we leave this branch collar, these are undifferentiated cells, they will be able to close over this wound as long as we leave these cells in place. And this is a good representation here. Oh, I lost the slide. So we want to leave that intact. We want to cut just from a point here to a point down here. We don't want to cut smooth against this trunk because we're removing all of that branch collar and all of that potential for sealing over, because trees don't heal, they just seal over wounds. So if we cut all this off, it's never going to seal over properly. And then that's a point of rot. Eventually the woodpeckers will love you and so on. So if we want to remove that branch that's bigger than our loppers can handle, we want to use that 3-cut method, or the jump cut, sometimes it's called, but a 3-cut method. So we start out from the branch collar. Depending on the size of the branch, maybe we're doing this, a whole foot away from the branch collar, and we're going to make an undercut first. Hopefully somewhere close to halfway through the branch. We're going to then go on the limb side of that first cut, and we're going to start to cut from the top. And then of course the weight is going to start to pull down, and once that thing starts to break, it will have to stop here. All of that cambial layer, that bark, will start to pull, but at least it'll break right here. And then your weight will be off. You can then handhold, hopefully safely, and then make your very fine-tuned cut from the top of the branch collar to the bottom of the branch collar. And you can do that with one hand on this stub and the other hand on your saw, and do it very accurately and precisely without the risk. Because if you don't do this cut, the risk is, this bark starts to peel and you're peeling all the way back down to the main leader. So we want to leave that collar intact. And when this is done properly, this is what you would start to see. Of course, these aren't examples of fruit trees, but they would do the same thing, is you start to just close that old wound off. If you say go a little bit too far on the top, you may end up with something like this. So again, we want to leave that branch collar. And so it may mean a little bit of a nub. It's not truly a stub, but maybe a little bit of a nub. It's not going to be a smooth cut right on the main trunk. And so this here is an example of a flush cut where they have removed, again, that branch collar on the top. This is not going to heal properly. It's going to look something like this. And again, this is just where wood rot is going to come in. You see tons of old apple trees all around, and this is what happens. And then the center just starts rotting out. And eventually, it may compromise the integrity of the tree. If we're talking about heading cuts, that angle is important. Usually we want to be cognizant of where the bud is, and we don't want to say cut below that bud like this example here. We want to be, on about a 45. So any water or wetness is draining away from the bud, but we don't want to leave too much. I've seen so many pruning cuts where, you end up with that dead little nub above where we left the bud. So just right above the bud with a slight angle down away from the bud side. And that's more for, our heading cuts. It's an example. I could probably show you examples of my old apple trees. Again, they cut too far into the branch collar, or maybe that branch was removed, at a diameter where it was probably never going to successfully seal over. And this is what ends up happening. So the squirrels love it. The other pests end up loving it. But ideally, this ends up closing off perfectly. And over time, on really thickly bark trees, you really don't even notice that there was a limb that was removed there. So that's the goal with removing any big limb. So this is a great case study. This gentleman called, he had a pear tree in the backyard. Remarkably, he told me this tree was only 6 years old. So that alone told me that this was, a standard size pear tree, which there's not as many rootstocks available for pears. But it probably never got any of the proper training for branch angles. Obviously, it grew too big and he wasn't able to thin that fruit. This is what you can expect on a pear tree in a year where there's no late freeze that thins the blossoms. This thing is an absolute mess. You might almost want to start over in a situation like this. And there's probably some fire blight that's starting to develop because of all the breakage and all the damage. This is a ton of weight on here. So branch angles are key. Putting it in the right spot is key, and really taking care of it those first few years, so you can then continue to manage it beyond year 5 and 6. So yeah, again, it was an impulse buy at the checkout line, and it did well until it didn't. So commitment to that tree in the first few years probably could have prevented some of this, but you see this quite often, especially with pear trees. If there are folks out there, I see a ton of old apple trees on the side of the road. So we all probably know someone who has them. These are questions that I have come up with because I undertook this project when we bought our house. And there's a lot of value in some of these older trees. Maybe they're an important variety, but you really want to know that this is a long-term undertaking, just getting this thing back. And are you up for that task? So And sometimes these trees, structurally are never going to be great. So, like this was one of my trees. This is a almost fatal flaw. Um, do we really want to spend weekends over the next 4 or 5 years trying to redevelop something that, again, is always going to be on death's door? So, again, some of your repair grafting and other things, they can only fix so much. This was actually all the compost that was inside here from over the years. It was beautiful compost. So, but if we're going to do this, help the neighbor or help, whoever bought these old trees, we can kind of start with some easy decisions, which are, again, diseased, dead, damaged. Probably I've very rarely seen any of these trees that had a central leader, but if you do have a central leader that can be found, try to work back to that. Remove any crossing stuff, anything growing upright, and really just try to open that thing up. That first year, if you do any sort of pruning, removing major branches, the amount of growth that's going to respond as a result is just going to be almost unbelievable. So if we're talking about trees, this is another term. Suckers, again, are from the rootstock. So we want to prune those out whenever we see them, middle of the summer, anytime, because those are a rootstock variety, not the variety that you have up here for fruit. And do not ever fertilize these things. You are already sending them into, rocket fuel space by pruning them. So we never want to fertilize. Maybe just do a better job, maybe some mulch or preventing, any damage around the base of the tree. But most of the time, our fruit trees, really most of our mature trees in the landscape do not need fertilizer. You may want to do a soil test and figure out if pH needs to be improved on. But other than that, this was an example of one of these old trees. So I did that the first year and removed some of the main culprits here in the middle. And this is what you can expect. Look at all this growth. Wow, tons of growth. And then my goal, what I tried to do was, boy, I've got some decent branches here. And then what I did was I removed those bigger branches that went up further. So I recentered the tree, brought it closer to the ground. It was fine. It was a fun little experiment. And actually, I started seeing fruit spurs fairly early on. But do we really want to do this? This was 3 years of just tons of work, still not seeing fruit. And I finally gave up on it, because again, these trees still have tons of flaws, tons of disease hiding in this old wood and stuff like that. So, at a certain point, you need to weigh the benefit versus a lot of the negative, which is these things are sort of reservoirs for diseases. And if you want to grow younger, better varieties, then I wouldn't keep these things around. So, but in certain situations, this was a client that called last year. She's, mainly just got this tree because it came with the property and the horses seem to enjoy it. So is there a way to maybe just make it a little bit healthier and get some better fruit? So I always like to approach these trees and look at them from all angles and figure out where the priorities, where the easy ones are to remove, knowing that I need to, stay somewhat conservative with about a third of the overall sort of leaf containing branches, no more than that. So this was the backside view. Again, these things just turn into rat's nests if you leave them alone. So what that would reveal is, there was some nice candidates for broken limbs, dead limbs, disease stuff. So, start there, then take a step back and see where your next stuff is. You'll notice this kind of old fruits hanging. Proper tree management. We always want to get that old mummified fruit out of the tree, especially at least by winter time. And all told, this is the way I left. So it's still a rat's nest on this side, but at least we opened it up a fair amount on this side. And I would expect this year, there's probably a ton of young, vigorous shoots that developed from that old sleeping latent wood. And now would be the year to really hone in and probably remove some of this, further out branches and recenter this tree. And really the only reason I told her this is a good candidate is because it wasn't a very big tree. You could do most of this from the ground or from a short step ladder. Some of these trees are far too big to really try to do this on. So summer pruning is critical. And most people just think about pruning in dormancy. And if we think about what dormant pruning does, it invigorates that plant. So if we're only ever pruning in dormancy, we're only ever creating more pruning for next year. So if we really want to get on top of these plants and keep them manageable and controllable, summer pruning is how we do that. So it is only supplemental to our dormant pruning. So it helps us to get better spray penetration and better sunlight exposure for ripening fruit, and increase the fruitfulness of our wood. Because usually if a branch or if wood is more than, say, 2 feet away from direct sun exposure, it will eventually just become architectural wood and not bud generating wood at that point. So in the summertime, we're always looking for water sprouts and root suckers. Those can be removed throughout the summer, and they probably will need to be removed. You should expect water sprouts and root suckers all year. So let's see here. And our summer pruning can help to sort of move wood into that vegetative stage of, or that reproductive stage of growth if we start to do some summer pruning. And you can see here on this younger apple tree, I did a summer pruning cut here. It then grew, and you see how I did this is I left an underside bud. Had I left a topside bud on this summer pruning cut, that growth would have gone straight up. I left an underside bud, so it had to continue on that same gentle course instead of just shooting straight up. And as a result, again, this grew after that summer pruning cut. This grew, but then at the base, we sped up the development of flower buds. These would not have occurred had I let this just continue on. So generally, we're leaving 1 to 2 nodes or buds if we're doing a summer pruning cut on something like a pear or an apple. On your figs, absolutely, you need to summer prune figs. My dormant pruning on figs is I like to prune back to about chest to eye level, because we know they're going to then grow. And this tree here is probably now at year 6 at my house. 1 year's worth of growth is about 6 feet. So I'm pruning back to anywhere in that, chest to eye level, knowing that if by September I've got a 5-foot shoot that comes out, I can at least still bend it down and grab the fruit off of it. In the summertime, you can see I went in here and removed a bunch of leaves, sort of lifted the skirt. If we're talking about, gardener pruning terms, lifted the skirt a little bit so I can see in this plant. And you're also sort of pruning these almost like tomatoes in the summertime, in that, you're removing suckers. So at the base of this, or at the tip of the shoot on figs, you'll start to have just more and more shoots. Not all of those are going to be able to continue to then grow and set fruit. So start removing those suckers, or shoot suckers, if you will, on your fig, and you'll allow that thing to put more energy into those fruits that are already starting to develop by, July, August, especially. So prune them like okra, remove the old leaves so you can see through there, and then prune them at the tips like you would your tomatoes, and you'll probably have more fruits quicker. Because some years, we're still waiting until mid-September to the end of September before we start to see fruits ripen. So that can help a lot. And my final thoughts is really, pruning is a skill that, I could talk about with you all day. I could show you pictures, but it's really about a confidence level. And so know that you're not going to just damage these trees. These plants need to be pruned, and you will probably under prune. So it's not a matter of I'm going to prune them too much or I'm going to hurt them. Just throw that to the side and start practicing, knowing that how to make a good cut there at the bud, a heading cut, clean tools, sharp tools, how to do that 3-cut method. You are not going to damage these plants. And I really like looking back on my plants a year later, 2 years later, because it really just makes you better in your understanding of plants and how they grow. So pruning in a way is almost like time traveling, because if I prune here, this is going to be the plant's response. If you come back a year later, sure enough, it did what it should have done. And yeah, and know that, at least those sequential pruning rules of dead, disease, damaged, crossing branches, that's sort of easy starting point for where we start. Water sprouts, suckers, and then the stuff going in the wrong pattern. So we've got tons of publications on fruit trees, small fruits, you name it. And then the USDA Pomological Watercolor is a great collection. There's a link there. So plant material, we're not able to have a plant sale this year, unfortunately. With COVID, all of these nurseries are just sold out. So there will be no spring plant sale, maybe a fall plant sale, I hope, but most of these places are out of inventory. So
Josh, we got a few questions. If you
all right.
Noreen wanted to know your thoughts on pruning sealer.
Pruning sealer is not recommended.